Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Sean Griffiths.
Welcome back, Sean. And if you're tired of picking between the lesser of two evils and news presented in either red or blue, welcome home, because every week we discuss the structural issues driving dysfunction in Washington and, more importantly, what we can do to fix it. Now, last week, another race in the 2026 midterms took shape, with Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp announcing he would not enter the race for Senate against incumbent Democrat Jon Ossoff. And I know we're talking about the midterms a year and a half out, but bear with us because this will make sense a little later on. Now, Kemp is very popular in the state. He's won statewide election twice, and he can't run for governor again due to term limits, begging the question why he's declining to run. We're going to explore that today because it reveals some interesting insight into the state of the GOP and whether Republicans with an appeal beyond the MAGA base are working at a disadvantage. But first, before we get into the episode, Sean and I have a quick PSA. Sean, I think you'd agree that we started this podcast because we knew there were folks out there like us who were frustrated with the options presented to us by the two-party system, frustrated with the vitriol, frustrated with the lack of action, and looking for real change. Would you agree with that, Sean?
Absolutely.
And I think I'll speak for both of us when I say we've been very happy with the response we've gotten so far. But we also know there are more of you out there. And so there are some things you can do to help us get the word out. The first is we've noticed a large number of listeners aren't subscribers yet. So if you're coming back to this for a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth time, whatever, go ahead and click the subscribe button on your device right now. It'll ensure you get the episodes as soon as they're released and also help us get found by more people like you on podcast platforms. We're juicing the algorithm, folks. Number two, if you are a first-time listener and you like what you hear today, be sure to subscribe, but also be sure to share it with one friend you think might like it too. Those simple things can help us grow this into a real movement and affect meaningful change. So that's my PSA. That out of the way, Sean, before we get into the main story, a couple things of note. We have a new pope.
We do.
Brand new pope.
American Pope, born in Chicago,
right?
White Sox fan. That's a big deal here.
Yeah, Chicago is one of those places too. You know, they really celebrate kind of the hometown heroes. Mm-hmm. I think if the Pope was from Boston, we'd become even more insufferable than we are today. Like, we would be absolute jerks about it and rubbing it in everybody else's faces. Yeah. So I think it couldn't have happened to a better city. I was watching the run up to the Pope coming out on the balcony, and all I could think about was how funny it would be if it was Biden. You know, I mean,
that would be hilarious.
He's old enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
in a way, that would be a step up from the president. Man, how Trump would respond to that?
I mean,
if that happened,
you know,
because that's almost a step up from the presidency. Because not only are you the leader of a country, but you are the leader for 1.5 billion people on this planet. So it's
not to mention like all the Da Vinci Code stuff you have going on in your basement. Trump is redecorating the Oval Office to look like the Vatican anyway, so you know he would be jealous. But that's for our next pope, I guess. Second thing of note, outside of the pope and the missed opportunity to punk Trump, was a story that broke last week. Trump was actually looking to raise income taxes for top earners. And congressional Republicans pushed back, which on its surface would look very much in line with the Republican brand. The thing I found interesting about this is that, and we've talked about this before, the Republicans have really become the party representing the less well-off. And the Republicans are also very, very careful about when they push against Trump. And so it was interesting to see them push back on this.
Right. So, as the Democratic Party has lost a lot of those blue collar Midwest workers, those manufacturer workers in key battleground states, to your point, the Republican Party has really capitalized on that to bring them over to the fold. And so they've become this party about the low income segments of American society. It really makes me wonder who's in Trump's ear right now, because history has shown with Trump that his positions on policy tend to always depend on who's in his ear at any given moment. And so what he's proposing isn't even a big increase. Certainly wouldn't be as big of an increase as progressive liberals would want. But what I find really funny and really interesting is that Trump's kind of justification for why Republicans shouldn't do this is, well, if we do this, the Democrats are going to rub it in our faces. And to me, I'm like, why does that matter? Why? Like, if it's good policy, it's good policy.
I absolutely love that. I mean, leave it to Trump to have Republicans nix a Republican policy, and Trump somehow manages to pin it on the Democrats preemptively. The other thing I'll just note, I'm not an economist, so take what I
Right.
say with a grain of salt. But my understanding is that an increase in the top marginal tax rate might have some impact,
Yeah.
but the ultra wealthy make most of their money through assets,
Yeah.
which are taxed via capital gains. So until you change the capital gains tax, it kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Again, not an
And
economist, not a tax expert. So take that
you're
with a grain
talking
of
about
salt.
very, very small changes to revenue coming in just because of how high income earners earn their income. It was almost like it was meant to offset some of these weird increases in budget that Trump has also proposed, like reopening Alcatraz, which would cost billions of dollars to do. But yeah, I'm not really sure what sparred this on for Trump. But I mean, the Republicans, they have their base that is all about no new tax increases, doesn't matter who it is, and no new spending. But of course, the Republican Party hasn't always been consistent with the no new spending.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you're not looking for cognitive dissonance, this is not the place to be.
Right.
Um, so let's move on to the main story then. This one caught my eye
Mhm.
for reasons that will become apparent as we get further down the line. Right now, it just looks like another annoying podcast talking about the midterms that are 18 months away. But bear with us. We were very, very judicious about our decision to move forward on this. So, main story, at a closed door donor retreat, Brian Kemp, governor of Georgia, again, as I said at the top, announced he would not be running for Senate. Now, he said it was, quote unquote, not the right decision for me and my family, which we all know is total BS and could only mean one of three things, which is either he feels he couldn't win the GOP primary, he feels he couldn't win the general election, or both.
Mhm.
Both are correct. And I have my own thoughts here. I don't know if you have any thoughts before I jump into it.
I would say, Brian Kemp has been popular with independents in his state, so I don't know if it's concerned that he can't beat Ossoff in a general election. I think he would actually stand a pretty good chance at winning an election against Ossoff. I think it's more to do with the GOP primary and this prospect of Marjorie Taylor Greene getting in. And I don't think Brian Kemp wants to lose a primary election against Marjorie Taylor Greene. I think that would be embarrassing to him.
That would be, yeah, Brett Favre level career decision right there. For those of you who aren't Green Bay Packers fans, just Google it. At any rate, yeah. So I kind of agree with you there. So I definitely think from the standpoint of the general election, beat Stacey Abrams in his last election by 7.5 points. And 2018 was not a favorable election year for Republicans, and he still won. So by a smaller amount, 1.5%, closest gubernatorial race in the state in decades. But I think there might be an argument to be made that 2026 might be worse than 2018 for the fact that maybe the economy isn't in such good shape, but he has better odds of winning a general election as a Republican in that state than really anybody else. I would agree with you on the GOP primary side of things because it would be a contested primary. Trump already tried to primary him out of existence in 2022. That failed. This time around, Marjorie Taylor Greene has hinted she'd get in the race, if not to win, to bend Kemp a little bit more in Trump's direction. So again, kind of going back to the original question, if we're to identify where Kemp's newfound interest in his family lies, it's probably more likely on the GOP primary side than the general election, maybe a mix of both.
What we've seen with a lot of Republican candidates and elected officials is if they resign or they choose not to run, odds are it's because they're worried about being primaried, or they're worried about losing a primary election to someone who's more of the ideological extreme type, the more MAGA crowd type, because they realize that in these primaries they draw low turnouts, and it's all about who can turn out that handful of voters that ends up showing up. And in the case of Georgia, all say Marjorie Taylor Greene would have to do is force a runoff. And then you have this runoff election where conventional wisdom says you take the primary turnout and you cut it in half, and that's even less voters that she has to turn out. And we know how strident the MAGA crowd is about showing up to vote. They could possibly tip the primary election in her favor in the case of a runoff.
There is some evidence to your claim that we are going to talk about in just a bit. There's one note I want to make here, though, before we go on, which is it is worth noting Kemp is not a centrist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, somehow Kemp got painted with the centrist brush when he decided to uphold the law and not overturn Georgia's election results in favor of Donald Trump in 2020. The reality is, as a governor, he signed one of the most expansive concealed carry laws in the country, one of the most restrictive abortion laws. This was before Roe v. Wade was overturned. And of course, we all know about his campaign ad when he was first running, when he sat by his pickup truck and said he'd personally drive criminal illegals, his terms, out of the state. That is a promise he has yet to follow through on. But now with Kemp out, we've got a virtual clown car of potential candidates. I'm going to run through these one by one because I think they're worth noting. So GOP on the whole, or GOP operatives in Georgia, want a consensus candidate. They want somebody who's going to unify the party and is also going to appeal to the broader electorate. And when we look at the current roster of potential candidates, it's not certain that this will happen. And I'll get into why in just a second. So we have kind of at the top of the list, Representative Buddy Carter. He's already declared his intention to run. He describes himself as a MAGA warrior, definitely well-liked by the primary crowd, but might have a tougher time winning over independents in the general election. So to give you two reasons why, he's one of 126 House members to sign an amicus brief supporting the Texas lawsuit against Pennsylvania challenging the 2020 election results. Recently introduced a bill for the U.S. to purchase Greenland and name it Red, White, and Blue Land. That resonates with moderate voters. Then we have Rep. Mike Collins, also pro-Trump, a little less colorful than our red, white, and blue friend Buddy. He would also appeal to the primary crowd, doesn't seem to have the personality to break through a crowded field. And then we've got another representative, Rich McCormick. He's former military ER doctor, really strong in suburban districts, great general election appeal. So you could also read that as doesn't stand a chance in the primary. And then there is the pièce de résistance, the person who needed her own segment in this outline, Sean, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And again, I'm going to say this, guessing that anyone listening to this probably already knows. She's a character, vocal supporter of QAnon, which, if you're unaware, is a conspiracy theory alleging that a secret cabal of Satan-worshiping pedophiles exists within the Democratic Party. She harassed David Hogg, survivor of the Parkland school shooting, calling him a coward and a paid actor, and blamed the wildfires in California on space lasers linked to the Rothschild family. Also, Sean, no stranger to crowded primaries. And this is where your comments really come into play here. So, worth noting, as you mentioned, Georgia has a runoff system of elections, which means if no candidate wins over 50% of the vote, they go to a second round election where the top two contenders compete head to head. Whoever wins that one wins. Primaries run the same way. First primary, she won with 40.3% of the vote. So she went up against a guy by the name of John Cowan or Cohen. I didn't bother to figure out how to pronounce that. Forgive me. He was a pro-Trump conservative, had more mainstream appeal. And the interesting thing here, Sean, in the first round candidates, all of them were similar to Cohen. So we had former legislators, military, and business owners who all were pro-Trump, but a little more mainstream. Now, Cohen goes on to lose the second round. And Sean, to your point here, to give you some hard numbers, Marjorie Taylor Greene's district had a little over 574,000 voters at the time. The first round of the primary, 78,000 voters turned out. So that's about 14% of all voters in the district. Second round, cut in half. So 49,000 voters, or about cut in half, or about 8.5% of all voters in the district. So Marjorie Taylor Greene won the first round with the approval of 5.5% of all voters in the district. The second round with a little under 5%, and because the district is dark red, she coasts to victory in the general election.
Right.
I know you've talked about Ted Cruz's election. It seems to follow a similar mold.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that is always the example I like to go to because it's both an interesting example and I lived in Texas in 2012 when it happened. Lieutenant Governor David Dewars actually won the initial primary election, but Cruz was able to get enough of the vote to force a runoff. And again, conventional wisdom is you cut turnout in half, and that's what you can expect in the primary. And you were already talking about a 12% GOP primary turnout, cut that in half, and that is ultimately who's deciding who the next senator of Texas is, which ends up being less than 4% of the eligible voting population. And the same thing happens here in Georgia as a result of having these very low turnout elections with even lower runoff elections.
Yeah, I think the only relatable analogy I can maybe give to primary voters is they're kind of like Swifties, and you have the Swiftie who maybe goes to one show when she's in town, and then you have the ones who seem to like double mortgage their house and fly all over the world and go to everyone.
So there's a real threat to Kemp here with MTG, I think more than any of the other candidates because she has that brand recognition, something we've talked about on this podcast before. It's increasingly becoming important for candidates to have their own brand, whether you're talking about Trump, Sanders, AOC, or Marjorie Taylor Greene. And it doesn't really matter how crazy they talk. You could talk about Jewish space lasers or migrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating dogs and cats. It doesn't really seem to matter to the primary crowd.
Yeah.
Because it's almost as if these voters think, well, if they're willing to be that bold and outspoken, that means they're going to go and they're actually going to fight for the causes that I want.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like we certainly can guess that they're not lying, or at least they're telling what they think the truth is, for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would say in this specific instance, Kemp understands that a crowded primary field is going to be a drain on resources for the general election, which will be challenging.
Yeah.
Marjorie Taylor Greene knows this is right in her wheelhouse. So Kemp sees a trap, walks away. Marjorie Taylor Greene sees it and goes running right at it with a selfie stick. And I think getting back to your issue of personal brand too, if she is one of the most prolific small dollar fundraisers in the Republican Party for all the crazy stuff she says. And I think this kind of gets to a bigger issue in the GOP and a bigger issue with the primary system overall, which is, as you mentioned before, primary voters, hardcore activist voters. The most enthusiastic voters are going to show up to a primary, and a subset of those, the most enthusiastic of most enthusiastic voters, are going to show up for a second primary. So that's like SEAL Team 6 of partisan voters, right? The partisans amongst the partisans. And what we also see is that with Trump having such strong control over the party tends to prefer candidates who fit that mold. And they generally don't do that well. And there's a whole list. You've got Herschel Walker in Georgia. You have Don Bolduc in New Hampshire. You have Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. You have Blake Masters. You have Kerry Lake. And so I think the question here is, where the party is so focused around Trump, can the party produce an electable candidate under the current system?
Well, it's interesting you say that because we have seen some Republicans come out and express concern about Marjorie Taylor Greene running. These are the old guard Republicans, the ones that would be more inclined to be more in the Liz Cheney camp of the party, that don't want to give, in a battleground state, the Democrats the advantage in a general election. Right? They still want to win. So you have this interesting situation with Republicans where they understand the benefit of a partisan primary system, where ultimately they have the most control as a party over who wins, or they can have a special interest group who is aligned with them, mobilize voters to get the candidate they want to win. But at the same time, that is moving candidates further and further more towards the MAGA crowd, further and further more towards the MTG crowd. And I think what you'll see is that there's an interesting contrast in the partisan primary system, where you are getting these less electable, less appealing to independent voters candidates winning the primaries, versus a state like Alaska, which has a nonpartisan primary system. Right, Lisa Murkowski, who's willing to speak out against Trump, vote against Trump in the Senate, vote for his second impeachment, and still get to the general election as a result of the nonpartisan primary system there, because not only do you have Republicans voting, but you have independents voting in the primary. You have disaffected Democrats who might like Murkowski also voting in the primary and helping her get to that general election stage.
Yeah. And one other note about Alaska that I'll bring up as well, and this is something we've talked about before. Mary Peltola, who was the first Democrat to be elected to Congress in Alaska in decades, owes her victory in part to the fact that her Republican opponent was Sarah Palin, a very, very MAGA candidate who didn't have wide appeal to a state that tilts overwhelmingly Republican. Now, Peltola lost her seat recently to Nick Begich, who's a bit more of a middle of the road Republican. But it tells us that if you have a system that allows middle of the road Republicans to exist, then you have a shot at winning these statewide elections. Conversely, if you have this sort of winner take all primary with or without a runoff, what can happen is, much like Marjorie Taylor Greene's first election, you could have a 4-person primary, 3 normal candidates break up the normie vote, and then you've got one whack job who manages to garner a winnable plurality, not even a majority.
I think the interesting thing about Begich, the interesting thing to note about him, is he favors overturning the new election system there in Alaska with nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting. Specifically, he's against the ranked choice voting part of it, even though RCV is the reason he won that election. And nonpartisan primaries are the reason that he made it to the top 4 anyway, because under a closed primary, as you said, he's more middle of the road. But in a closed primary system, that favors the one that's going to lean more conservative, the one that's going to be more in the MAGA camp as a result of where the party is right now.
Yeah. Do you think Begich is really against it, though, or do you think he's sort of just parroting the GOP?
I think that's it. I think he's parroting the GOP. He's trying to win. He's trying to maintain favor with that crowd within the Republican Party that's going to help keep him elected in Alaska. So.
He can sort of say it and just be like, oh, it's terrible, but never want it to be overturned. Kind of like Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, and now he has the benefit of incumbency. So he could probably get through a primary, even if you had a more MAGA-friendly candidate. It's not a guarantee, but again, there is still somewhat an advantage to incumbency.
Yeah, and one other note I'll make here too, since we're on the topic of ranked choice voting, is if we go back to Marjorie Taylor Greene's first primary, the reality is it was crowded, but there were more candidates who were like her opponent than there were like her.
Mm-hmm.
So first round of the primary, 60% of the vote went to more moderate mainstream Republicans. 40% went to her. And she really benefited the second time around from a decreased turnout. And I think that, if you're a Republican, you're listening to this, you might be like, who cares? Marjorie Taylor Greene's district is so red, she was going to win anyway. We're not losing anything. The flip side of that is that she might end up losing the Senate for your party in Georgia, because you have a system that just packs the party with folks who can only appeal to the activist base.
So we started this conversation talking about tax cuts and cuts to the budgets and costs. I find it interesting that Republicans aren't more willing to get on board with a system like RCV, because ultimately it saves the taxpayers millions of dollars. Organizations like Fair Vote, especially in states like Georgia, have calculated the cost in the tens of millions to voters if they move to RCV to avoid an incredibly low turnout runoff that is going to produce someone who was nominated with 3-4% of the eligible voting population.
In Fulton County, Georgia, and I don't have the figures in front of me, so I may get this wrong, but in the Senate runoff in 2020, I think cost Fulton County about $6 million, I want to say. Again, don't quote me on this figure. I don't know the exact dollar amount. What I do know is that the amount they spent on that runoff was almost equal to the budget shortfall for Fulton County schools that same year. So to your point, not only does it produce better candidates or candidates with a wider appeal, but it also has a serious impact on state and county budgets. And especially now where more states, more cities are having to deal with less federal funding, that's going to be important. So, moral of the story, you can spend your money with runoff elections to advance people who are never going to have wide appeal, or ranked choice voting. Better ingredients, better pizza, Papa John's. We weren't paid for that. I just felt like it fit very well. So you can take that for what it's worth. That seems like as good a place to stop as any. Thank you all again for listening. As Sean and I mentioned before, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to subscribe. Be sure to share it with anyone you think might like it too. And if you'd be so nice as to rate us and write a review, that would also help us be more visible in front of people such as yourself. The music you're listening to is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you once again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.